The descent onto Vareth 9 was unlike anything the cadets had ever experienced. Even before the landing gear touched the frozen surface, the transport ship groaned as if the planet itself was rejecting its presence. The viewport glass frosted over within seconds, thick layers of ice forming intricate white veins that crawled across the hull. Evan Cole stood at the observation window, his breath fogging the glass, watching the dull violet atmosphere swirl beneath the ship like a living storm. The readouts were grim. External temperatures had dropped below minus 100 degrees Celsius, the lowest ever recorded on any inhabited test world. The Galactic Academy had chosen this planet as part of the Cryo-Endurance Trial, a survival test meant to push every cadet past the limits of endurance. But even the instructors wrapped in thermal armor muttered that this world was crueler than the briefings had suggested. When the hatch opened, the air seemed to strike like a weapon. It tore through every layer of insulation and burned the lungs with a pain that made even the reptilian species gasp and stumble. The ground was not snow, but solid crystal ice, fractured and shimmering, layered with blue reflections of the dim sun above. Within minutes, the cadets' boots began to freeze into the surface, and several had to be helped out before losing their footing entirely. Evan moved carefully, feeling the crunch and resistance under each step. The human suit was designed for extreme climates, but even it struggled against the violence of the cold. His visor displayed frost buildup warnings every 30 seconds, and his oxygen regulator clicked and groaned like a dying engine. The first few hours were chaos. The alien cadets from the Thrax and Varelian species argued over where to establish base camp, each insisting on terrain familiar to their physiology. The Thrax wanted high ground to escape subterranean predators, while the Varelians wanted to settle in the ice valleys, claiming the wind pressure there was lower. Evan listened without speaking. He observed the environment, the faint patterns in the ice, the sound it made when stepped on, and the strange vibration he could feel through the soles of his boots. It wasn't just the wind or geological movement. It was rhythmic, distant, almost alive. He crouched, pressed a gloved hand to the surface, and closed his eyes. Beneath the thick crust, he felt something, a pulse or a whisper of heat, so subtle it could have been his imagination. By the time shelters were erected, the first disaster had already struck. The plasma furnaces brought from the Academy transport were supposed to generate heat for weeks. Instead, within hours, every single one began to malfunction. The liquid plasma that fueled them thickened and froze, clogging the internal coils. One by one, the lights on the control panels flickered red, then died completely. The alien engineers tried to reignite them, cursing through clenched jaws as frost gathered on their hands and antennae. The cold wasn't just freezing the equipment, it was altering the metal itself. The alloys contracted, cracked, and snapped like brittle glass. A single furnace explosion shattered 3 storage crates and sent shards of burning debris into the snow. For a brief moment, the flame illuminated the faces around it, faces twisted in both awe and despair. Then the light faded, leaving nothing but darkness and silence. Evan took refuge in a temporary shelter with 4 others. The structure was a collapsible dome made of carbon fabric, coated with thermal foam. But even inside, the temperature hovered barely above freezing. The others huddled close, using portable heat capsules, though most were already losing sensation in their extremities. The alien cadet beside him, a slender Varelian with translucent skin, whispered through chattering teeth that she could feel her blood slowing. Evan removed one of his gloves and placed his bare hand on the wall of the shelter. The surface was trembling. The cold wasn't stable. It pulsed in waves, as if the planet was breathing through ice. He didn't say anything. The others were panicking, speaking in fragments about rescue signals, frozen circuits, and incoming storms. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing. The storm was gaining strength, and the sky had turned into a violent spiral of snow and fractured light. The auroras above flickered between green and purple, distorted by magnetic interference. Evan pushed open the shelter flap just enough to look outside. In that chaos, he saw the outlines of broken furnaces, twisted metal half buried in ice, and drifting figures trying to dig trenches for protection. But it was futile. The ice was alive. It expanded faster than they could dig. Every pit they made filled instantly with solid frost. It was as though the planet itself rejected motion, sealing over any trace of disturbance. He returned inside, sat quietly, and unrolled a piece of thermal foil to protect his equipment. He opened his small geological scanner, a device no larger than a palm, and placed its sensor against the floor. The data feed took several minutes to stabilize, flickering in the dim light. The readings shocked him. Beneath 30 meters of solid ice, there was a layer of porous material, sediment. Below that, a thin but detectable current of geothermal activity. The numbers were faint, but real. The planet wasn't completely dead. There was something alive deep below, something generating faint heat. He whispered to himself, his voice nearly lost to the howl of wind outside. "It's breathing under there." The night stretched endlessly. The Academy's instructors tried to maintain communication across the encampment, but half the transmitters froze solid, and even the emergency frequency crackled with static. The cadets were told to conserve energy and wait for further orders, though everyone silently knew that if the storm continued, there would be no further orders at all. Evan couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the creaks of ice pressing against the shelter walls, the occasional snap of frozen fabric, and the muffled sobs of a cadet who couldn't bear the cold any longer. He thought about Earth, the deserts of Arizona where he had trained for endurance, the warmth of the sun on rock, the smell of dust. It felt like another universe entirely. Here, there was no sun, no scent, no life, only white, wind, and the endless groaning of a planet colder than death. In the early hours, when the temperature dropped to record lows, the first casualty came. One of the outer patrols had frozen solid while attempting to retrieve rations. His body was found standing upright, eyes open, encased entirely in ice. The discovery broke morale completely. Some cadets refused to leave their shelters. Others argued about activating the emergency beacon again, though the signal could barely travel through the storm. Evan volunteered to take a shift outside to monitor the perimeter. When he stepped into the blizzard, the cold bit through his visor instantly. The world had turned to fog and shards of crystal, each snowflake like a knife. He moved slowly, methodically, marking the location of fallen equipment. Then he saw it again, the same pattern in the ice that had caught his attention earlier, cracks forming in a ring shape, thin vapor escaping from within. He kneeled, brushing away the top layer, and saw a faint orange glow deep below, like an ember caught in glass. He stared at it, mesmerized. For a moment he thought it was just light refraction, but when he pressed his gloved hand closer, he felt warmth. Actual warmth. It was weak, but it existed. Something beneath was still burning, geothermal pockets perhaps, or ancient magma flows trapped under kilometers of ice. His heart began to pound. The discovery was impossible under these conditions, yet the evidence was right there. He stayed crouched until his suit alarm screamed for him to return to shelter, then reluctantly covered the spot with snow to mark it. When he re-entered the base, his commander, a stern Avrelian female named Sira, demanded to know what he was doing outside. He simply said, "The planet isn't dead. There's heat under the ice." She stared at him for a long moment, then turned away without answering, dismissing it as delirium from exposure. But Evan knew what he felt. The planet had given him a sign, a pulse beneath the frost, a whisper of fire waiting to be freed. That night, as others prayed or slept, he sat alone near the frozen entrance of the shelter, staring out at the endless storm. The auroras danced above like phantom rivers, green and violet lights shimmering against the black sky. He imagined what might lie below the crust, caves filled with steam, rivers of warmth that no one had ever seen. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that survival wasn't about waiting for rescue. It was about transformation. And somewhere beneath that ice, the planet was offering him the key. All he had to do was dig. The storm had not stopped for 3 days. The white sky of Vareth 9 pulsed like a living wound, bleeding endless snow and wind that screamed through the shattered remains of the camp. By now, most cadets had stopped counting time. The digital clocks inside their helmets froze, and their internal suits ran on emergency cycles. The once coordinated survival mission had dissolved into quiet despair. Only the flicker of blue emergency lights and the distant hum of malfunctioning machinery broke the monotony of silence. But amid the frozen chaos, Evan Cole had begun something that made him forget about time entirely. He stood alone beyond the camp's perimeter, crouched near the place where he had once felt warmth. His shovel, improvised from a broken furnace plate, bit into the ice with slow, grating effort. The metal rang each time it struck the surface, echoing into the void like a bell. He He had chosen his moment carefully. Most cadets were sleeping or pretending to sleep, unwilling to acknowledge how hopeless things had become. His commander, Sira, had warned him not to wander, but her voice had lost authority in the frost. Every order issued now felt like a whisper swallowed by the wind. He knew if he stayed idle, he would die like the others, quietly, waiting for a rescue that would never come. Each swing of the shovel numbed his arms further, but he didn't stop. The frost resisted like steel, cracking only in small, stubborn layers. After hours, he reached a patch where the texture changed. The ice grew smoother, translucent, and faintly hollow beneath his strikes. He pressed his gloved ear to it and heard something faint, a muffled rush like the whisper of boiling water in the depths. His heart quickened. There was something alive under the planet's skin. He removed his gloves and placed his bare fingers on the surface. The shock nearly made him gasp. The ice burned with cold, yet there was a subtle vibration underneath, as though the world was humming softly. His breath fogged in front of him, freezing instantly into tiny crystals. The air tasted metallic, tinged with minerals carried by unseen vapors. It was proof that something moved below. He marked the spot with a strip of orange insulation tape scavenged from the broken shelter and began digging again. The shovel snapped after another hour. He sat back, panting, staring at the broken tool. The ground was harder now, more defiant, as if warning him to stop. He flexed his fingers, the skin already cracked and bleeding from the cold, and thought about giving up. But the faint warmth under the ice felt like a pulse, a reminder that life could still exist here. He gathered his remaining energy and continued with his hands. Every scrape sent waves of pain through his arms, but eventually he exposed a small vent, no wider than his wrist. From it, a thin vapor escaped, white, trembling, and faintly warm. He bent close, watching the steam twist and vanish into the air. The sight was beautiful in its simplicity. Against a landscape of absolute stillness, this tiny vent breathed, defying the frozen laws of the planet. He placed his hand directly over it and smiled despite his cracked lips. The warmth was weak, but real. For the first time since landing, he felt something alive on Varith 9. Evan returned to the camp and began searching for anything that could help him explore deeper. Inside the storage module, he found an old maintenance kit with a damaged plasma torch, 3 meters of copper tubing, and a small pack of ceramic filters. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin experimenting. He stripped the torch of its cracked handle and repaired its ignition with copper wire. The repairs were crude, something his instructors would have laughed at, but he didn't care. He only needed it to melt a few layers, not build machinery. When he stepped outside again, 2 cadets followed him, a Thrax male named Jarrell and a silent, broad-shouldered human instructor who had stopped intervening days ago. The Thrax was curious but skeptical. His reptilian features were half covered in frost, and his voice hissed each time he spoke. "You dig in the middle of the storm. For what? To die faster?" Evan only answered, "To live longer." Jarrell stared at him for a long time before finally nodding and helping carry the tubing. The plasma torch roared to life, its weak flame hissing against the ice. Evan guided it in slow, circular motions, carving the frozen surface around the vent. Steam rose instantly, thicker and more vibrant this time. The smell of sulfur filled the air, sharp and hot enough to sting the eyes. The Thrax hissed in discomfort, backing away, but Evan stayed close, studying how the heat reacted. The steam came in pulses, like breathing. The pattern confirmed his suspicion. Below the ice, the planet's crust was alive with geothermal pressure, trapped for centuries beneath the frozen layers. They worked in shifts for hours, expanding the vent into a narrow shaft. The deeper they went, the more the air changed. The metallic scent of minerals grew stronger, and faint droplets began to condense along the walls, freezing into translucent beads. Jarrell, who had begun mocking the project earlier, now said nothing. His hands moved faster, his eyes glowing faintly in the low light. When the shaft reached his waist, a sudden burst of vapor shot upward, nearly knocking him backward. The heat was intense compared to the freezing air around them. Evan shouted over the roar, "It's pressure from below! The planet's venting!" For a moment, the wind seemed to quiet. The steam rose high into the air, catching the aurora's light. The entire camp noticed. Figures began emerging from the shelters, their visors reflecting green and purple as they stared at the strange glowing pillar. Whispers spread quickly. Some thought the planet was cracking. Others feared a volcanic rupture. But when they approached, the warmth brushed against their frozen armor, thawing layers of frost from their visors. For the first time in days, everyone felt warmth on their faces. Evan stood beside the vent, exhausted but smiling. The experiment had worked. He knew it was only the beginning. This small vent could not heat a camp or cook a meal, but it proved a truth that no one had believed. Beneath the ice, Vareth 9 was not a dead world. It was a sleeping one. The warmth he had uncovered was the planet's heartbeat. And if it could be channeled, if it could be expanded, then the colony might yet survive. That night, the commander summoned him. Her expression was unreadable behind her frost-covered visor. "You disobeyed direct orders," she said. "You endangered yourself and others." He stood straight, his body still trembling from exhaustion. "I found a vent," he answered simply. "A source of heat, not radiation, not chemical, real geothermal energy." She said nothing for several seconds, then turned to the holographic console and ran his readings. The temperature at the vent's mouth registered 23 degrees above ambient. It was undeniable. The data spoke for itself. "You think you can build something from this?" she asked. "If I can reach the deeper layers, yes," he replied. "We can channel the heat, maybe create shafts to trap and direct it." She looked at him sharply. "You mean build wells?" He nodded. "Yes, heat wells. It's possible if we use the right materials." The commander dismissed him with a curt nod, but as he left, she stared at the display long after he was gone. Outside, he returned to his tent, unable to sleep. His hands were bleeding, his joints stiff, but his mind burned with possibilities. He drew crude sketches in the frost on the tent floor, vertical shafts, insulated tubes, vents that could be expanded into chambers. He thought about how primitive humans had once drawn fire from the earth on their own world, how geothermal vents had been used in ancient settlements to cook and heat. The idea wasn't new, but out here, on a planet that had killed every furnace and shattered every machine, it was revolutionary. Before dawn, the storm weakened slightly. The sky brightened, revealing an endless white wasteland stretching to the horizon. Steam still drifted from the vent, rising in thin, graceful ribbons. Evan walked up to it again, crouching low, feeling the faint warmth brush his face. The Thrax cadet approached, carrying a handful of metal scraps. "You dig again?" Jarrell asked. "No," Evan said softly. "I build." He began assembling a small barrier of rocks and melted ice around the vent, shaping it into a crude ring. He inserted the copper tube down the center and wrapped the ceramic filter over its mouth to stabilize the pressure. When the next pulse of heat came, the steam shot through the tube and hissed gently, spreading warmth around instead of losing it to the wind. It wasn't much, but when he placed his hands near the outlet, he could feel steady heat radiating out. Enough to warm a small shelter, enough to cook, enough to live. He stared at the tiny device glowing faintly in the cold. Around him, the wind howled, the ice groaned, and the sky swirled endlessly, but he felt, for the first time since landing, that the planet was no longer his enemy. The frozen surface above him was a wall, yes, but beneath it was power, untamed and waiting. As he rose, watching the auroras fade into morning, he whispered under his breath, "You breathe, and I'll learn to listen." And somewhere deep below, the planet seemed to answer with a low, distant rumble. The next morning brought a silence so complete that it seemed unnatural. The wind had stilled, the clouds had thinned, and Vareth 9 lay beneath a pale sky that glowed like the inside of a frozen gemstone. The camp, once filled with the constant sound of groaning metal and snapping frost, was now eerily quiet. The vent Evan had built during the night continued to breathe softly, releasing gentle waves of steam that danced in the cold air. For the first time since the trial began, the temperature around the humans' shelter rose above freezing. It was small, local, and fragile, but it was proof that warmth could exist in this world. Evan awoke to find Jarrell already outside, inspecting the vent. The Thrax's reptilian skin gleamed faintly from the moisture in the air, his scales reflecting the light of the low sun like shards of obsidian. "It still breathes," Jarrell said, crouching beside the copper tube. "The air is wet now." Evan joined him, feeling the steam brush against his gloved fingers. "That's what we need," he said. "Moisture means heat. Heat means life." He began checking the seals he had made from melted ice and clay, pressing the edges until the steam hissed more evenly. "We can build more of these," he murmured. "If we connect them, we can channel the warmth into the shelters." The idea spread quickly. Word had already reached the commander, and soon small groups of cadets appeared, curious and cautious. The human explained his plan in clipped sentences, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. He described how the planet's heat traveled through trapped gas pockets and how those could be released by carefully melting specific areas of ice. Most of the aliens did not fully understand the humans' geological logic, but they could not deny the result. The air around the vent was warm enough to thaw a frozen ration pack in minutes. By midday, Evan led a small team toward a new site he had marked several kilometers from the main camp. The location was chosen based on the faint tremors he had recorded the night before, the same rhythmic pulses that had guided him to the first vent. The snow was knee-deep, the ice brittle and glittering under the strange sunlight. Each step crunched with a metallic sound, as though the planet itself were made of glass. Behind him, Jarrell carried salvaged equipment, metal rods, a damaged plasma cutter, and the remnants of a thermal shield from one of the broken furnaces. 2 more cadets followed, a cautious insectoid from the Seltan species and a quiet reptilian female named Raka. She spoke little but observed everything, her golden eyes unblinking as she walked. When they reached the site, Evan knelt and pressed his hand against the surface. He could feel it again, the vibration, faint but steady. He turned to Jarrell and nodded. "Here," he said. "We start here." The group began working, carving through the first layers with the plasma cutter, the air filled with the sharp hiss of melting ice and the acrid smell of vaporized minerals. Steam rose in thin ribbons, and droplets formed on the cadet's armor, freezing instantly into tiny crystals. The work was slow, the cold relentless, but the deeper they dug, the stronger the vibration became. It was as if the planet's pulse grew louder the closer they approached its heart. After several hours, the cutter sputtered and died. The last charge in its core had been spent. Evan wiped the frost from his visor and peered into the pit. They had reached a depth of 4 meters, and the ice at the bottom was dark, nearly black from mineral deposits. He leaned closer, feeling heat radiating faintly through the air. "There's pressure here," he said. "It's close." He motioned for Jarrell to pass him the metal rod, then jammed it into the center of the pit. The ground responded with a dull groan. A deep crack formed, spreading outward like lightning beneath glass. Everyone froze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground exhaled. A column of steam erupted with such force that it knocked Evan backward into the snow. The others scrambled away as vapor roared skyward, filling the air with a deep, vibrating hum. The heat struck like a living thing, wet, heavy, and primal. It was the Earth's breath, unleashed from centuries of imprisonment beneath the frozen shell. The snow around the pit began to melt in wide circles, forming shallow pools of steaming water. Evan rose slowly, shielding his face from the wave of heat. His heart pounded with a strange mixture of fear and awe. "We found it," he whispered. "The fire under the ice." Jarrell stared in disbelief. "You broke the planet open," he said, his voice trembling. "No," Evan answered, shaking his head. "I just woke it up." The Thrax watched as the human began inspecting the edges of the pit, touching the warm stone that now lined its sides. Beneath the frost, veins of red mineral glowed faintly, pulsing with inner light. It looked almost alive. Evan reached out with his glove, pressing it against the surface. The warmth seeped through instantly, so pure and strong that his hand began to sweat inside the suit. "This is geothermal energy," he said. "We can use it." He began working without pause, shouting instructions to the others. The copper tubes were placed inside the vent to channel the rising heat. The thermal shield was bent and reshaped into a makeshift cover to control the pressure, while the Seltan cadet used his natural adhesive secretion to seal the gaps around the edges. As the steam stabilized, Evan built a crude platform of stones above the vent, layering them in a spiral pattern to trap and distribute the warmth. He placed a ration tin in the center of the platform and waited. Within minutes, the contents began to thaw, then bubble. The cadets watched in stunned silence as steam rose in soft curls from the tin. The human had done it. He had cooked food on a frozen planet. When they returned to camp, the story spread like wildfire. The human had drawn fire from beneath the world's skin. Cadets gathered around the vent, whispering in disbelief as they watched steam rise from the hole. Some called it a miracle, others a fluke, but no one could deny the warmth. The commander arrived shortly after, silent as she observed the operation. Her eyes followed the steam as it swirled upward, catching the aurora's glow. "You risked destabilizing the crust," she said finally. "You could have killed us all." Evan met her gaze steadily. "Or saved us," he replied. "Now we have heat, food, and water." She said nothing more, only turned to watch the vent. That night, the camp transformed. The cadets gathered around the new heat well, their frozen suits thawing, their stiff limbs relaxing. The air was alive with motion again, steam drifting upward, laughter echoing softly through the frost, the faint sound of boiling water in the distance. Evan sat apart watching it all. His hands were blistered and his face burned from the heat, but he couldn't stop smiling. He had seen something sacred today, something ancient and raw. The planet had spoken to him through fire, and he had answered through creation. When the others fell asleep, he returned alone to the vent. The steam rose gently, glowing in the darkness. He crouched beside it, touching the stone rim. It pulsed faintly, releasing a low hum. He could almost imagine the planet whispering through that vibration, a deep, wordless sound, older than language. He whispered back, "I'll build more. I'll bring your warmth to the surface." He looked at the horizon. The auroras had faded, replaced by a faint golden light creeping across the sky. Perhaps it was dawn, or perhaps the planet was changing, its atmosphere responding to the shift in heat below. He didn't know, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that the cold had met its match, not in technology, not in machines, but in human persistence. As he turned back toward the camp, the first faint gusts of wind returned, carrying the smell of minerals and warmth instead of death. He realized that the planet wasn't trying to kill them. It was testing them, asking if they were worthy of its power. And for the first time, the human had answered not with fear, but with fire. The transformation began slowly, almost quietly, like the first breath of spring beneath an endless winter. By the following day, the storm that had buried the camp in despair had thinned into a ghostly haze. The vent that Evan had opened was no longer a solitary miracle. It was a blueprint. The warmth that once rose from one pit now pulsed across the landscape in expanding rings of steam, each one signaling a new beginning. He stood on a ridge of frost and watched as small teams of cadets, armed with salvage tools and fragments of equipment, began to mimic his design. Columns of vapor marked their progress, dotting the frozen plain like scattered beacons of survival. The commander had issued new orders that morning, orders built entirely around the human's idea. She had not said it aloud, but everyone understood that the planet had changed because of him. The official log described the project as thermal resource expansion, but the cadets called it something simpler, the Human Wells. The name spread quickly, whispered across the comms with reverence. Even the most cynical of the alien cadets, those who had once dismissed Evan as reckless or delusional, now sought his guidance. He no longer needed to argue or convince anyone. His proof was the air itself. Air that no longer bit the skin like shards of glass, but carried a faint, steady warmth. Evan spent the morning walking between the sites, inspecting each new vent. The first few were crude, uneven, and often unstable, but they worked. He taught the cadets how to use pressure valves to prevent violent bursts, how to angle copper pipes to direct the rising heat toward their shelters, and how to layer the stone rings to trap the steam efficiently. Every mistake became a lesson. When one vent erupted too violently, scalding the snow into boiling water, he modified the filters to slow the release. When another froze shut from condensation, he introduced a drainage system using the hollow bones of the Celton species, whose natural resin could resist frost. Every problem pushed him to think differently, and with each adjustment, the wells grew stronger. By midday, the once silent valley had become a living network of motion and sound. Steam hissed softly across the ice, creating a thin mist that drifted around the camp. The ground, which had once reflected light like glass, now shimmered with tiny pools of liquid. Alien cadets worked side by side, their breath no longer crystallizing instantly, their laughter faint but unmistakable. Jarrell, the Thrax who had been with him since the beginning, now acted as his second pair of hands. His strength allowed him to move heavy metal pieces that Evan could not, and his sharp claws carved channels in the ice to connect one vent to another. Together, they built the first interconnected system, a line of 5 wells whose combined heat could sustain a small section of the camp. When the system activated, a soft rumble moved beneath their feet. The steam rose evenly, spreading through the connecting tunnels and into the shelters. The effect was immediate. Frost began to melt from the fabric walls, and the air inside thickened with humidity. The cadets gathered inside, rubbing their numb fingers against the warmth that enveloped them. Some cried openly, their tears steaming on their cheeks. Others simply sat in silence, unable to comprehend the comfort of heat after so much cold. Evan stood in the doorway, watching the condensation drip from the ceiling. The shelters glowed faintly from the light of the nearby vents, turning the entire area into a shimmering cavern of warmth. For the first time, the camp smelled of life, wet stone, melted snow, and the faint metallic scent of steam. The commander arrived later, her face shadowed beneath her frost-covered helmet. She walked among the wells without speaking, observing the construction and the cadets who now moved with renewed energy. When she reached Evan, she paused, the steam curling between them like a curtain. "You've turned this place into something I almost recognize," she said. He smiled faintly. "Home?" She hesitated, then nodded once. "Something like that." For a moment, she seemed to drop her official tone. "You've done what no one else could. But understand this, human. The planet is still dangerous. If the crust beneath us shifts, these wells could collapse, or worse, ignite." He met her gaze, his expression calm but determined. "Then I'll build better ones," he said. She studied him for a long moment before turning away. Her silence was not disapproval anymore, it was respect. The following days blurred into a rhythm of labor and creation. The cadets worked in shifts, expanding the network of heat wells across the valley. Each new vent became easier to build as Evan refined the technique. He began experimenting with stone molds, creating curved channels to distribute heat more evenly. Raka, the reptilian engineer, introduced the idea of using the planet's natural mineral crust to reinforce the shafts. Her species had an instinctive understanding of geology, and under her guidance, the team began shaping the wells with precision rather than brute force. The humans' idea had become a collaborative science, a union of minds driven not by hierarchy, but by survival. The alien camp, once a scattered collection of freezing shelters, now resembled a small colony. The air was no longer silent. The hiss of steam and the low rumble of underground pressure created a steady background hum, a sound that felt alive. The ground around the wells had softened, revealing patches of dark rock. Thin rivers of melted water flowed between them, glistening under the pale light. For the first time since arrival, living organisms began to emerge. Tiny frost spores, awakened by the sudden warmth, spread across the wet surfaces. A few cadets collected samples, whispering excitedly about the possibility of native life returning to the surface. Evan didn't stop. Even when the others rested, he continued working through the long polar twilight, adjusting valves, reinforcing channels, testing the flow of heat with his bare hands. His gloves had long since burned through, his skin rough and scarred from exposure. But he didn't care. Every well felt like a heartbeat, a rhythm of defiance against the cold. He began naming them, small, simple names whispered under his breath. Dawn, breath, home, firebirth. To him, each one was more than machinery. Each was a promise that life could endure in the harshest world. One evening, as he worked near the newest vent, Jarrell approached him carrying a container of melted water. "You push too hard," the Thrax said, setting the container down beside him. "You don't stop even when your body begs you to." Evan smiled faintly, his face streaked with soot. "If I stop, the fire might fade." Jarrell snorted, his sharp teeth glinting in the steam. "The fire is strong now. You've given it roots. Maybe it doesn't need you to watch it every second." Evan didn't answer. He only stared into the glowing vent, the light painting his features with orange and gold. "Every fire needs tending," he said quietly, "especially the first one." Later that night, the commander announced over the comms that the survival trial had been extended. The extraction ships could not yet reach the surface because the atmosphere had shifted due to thermal distortion. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The planet had been too cold to sustain them before, and now it was too unstable because of the heat. Yet no one panicked. For the first time, the thought of staying longer did not bring fear. The colony could survive. The cadets had built something sustainable, something truly their own. As the sky darkened and the auroras began to shimmer once more, Evan walked through the colony, listening to the soft breathing of the vents. The mist that rose from them caught the light, painting the world in hues of emerald and violet. He stopped at the first well, the one he had dug alone, when everything still felt impossible. Steam rose steadily from its heart, swirling around him like a living spirit. He crouched beside it and placed his hand over the opening. The warmth that touched his palm was steady and calm, no longer wild or desperate. He looked around at what had become of the barren wasteland. The planet that had once sought to bury them now sheltered them in its heat. He realized then that Vareth 9 wasn't merely being tamed, it was being healed. The cold no longer seemed endless. It was a shell cracking open, releasing the life trapped beneath. The humans and aliens had done something extraordinary together. They had not conquered the planet. They had learned to live with it, to coax its warmth from the depths rather than demand it. That night, as he stood watching the steam rise against the stars, Evan felt the faint tremor of the planet's core beneath his feet. It was steady, rhythmic, almost like a pulse. He smiled softly, whispering into the night, "You're waking up, aren't you?" The ground answered with a low, distant hum, so deep and warm that it felt alive. The day the rescue signal returned, the entire valley was already alive with steam. It rolled across the landscape like a living sea, drifting over the colony's domes and the dark mouths of the heat wells that glowed beneath the ice. The cold sun of Vareth 9 hung low on the horizon, pale and distorted by vapor, yet the light that reached the ground was warm now, refracted through mist that shimmered with hidden color. The frost plains that had once seemed eternal were no longer white. They had darkened into a spectrum of blue and silver as minerals rose to the surface through the thawing crust. The world that had been frozen into silence was breathing again, and Evan Cole could feel it with every step. He walked slowly through the colony, his boots sinking into soft, damp snow that hissed under his weight. The air around him vibrated faintly with the rhythm of the planet's heartbeat. Each heat well released a low, pulsing hum as steam rose in steady intervals. The sounds blended into a kind of music, an organic harmony that filled the valley like a choir of the earth itself. Above the sound of vapor and water, he could hear the faint chatter of cadets at work. Their voices carried easily now, no longer muffled by suffocating cold. He passed groups of alien engineers reinforcing vent casings, others harvesting melted water, and some simply standing in the mist with their visors off, letting the warmth touch their bare skin. When he reached the command shelter, the door slid open automatically for the first time in weeks. The systems had thawed completely. Inside, the commander stood near the console, her frost-covered uniform replaced by a lighter thermal layer. She looked up at him, her expression calm but distant. "We've received contact from orbit," she said. Her voice carried a tone he had not heard before, something that balanced between pride and reluctance. The Academy ships broke through the upper atmosphere. "They'll arrive in 30 hours. Evan nodded slowly. He had imagined this moment many times, yet now that it had come, it felt oddly hollow. "You sound disappointed," he said quietly. She gave a small, humorless smile. "Perhaps I am. This world was supposed to be a test of endurance. Instead, it became something else." She gestured toward the window. From inside the control dome, the view stretched across the valley, showing the dozens of heat wells rising like glowing lanterns in the fog. "What you built here changed the parameters of the trial," she continued. "You didn't endure the planet, you changed it." He glanced out at the landscape, the vapor swirling through faint sunlight, and said softly, "I didn't change it, I just listened." She watched him for a moment longer before turning back to her instruments. "The extraction team wants a report on energy readings," she said. "Tell them what you found down there." He smiled faintly. "They wouldn't believe me if I did." He left the command dome and climbed the ridge overlooking the colony. From there, he could see everything: the steam vents, the shelters, the network of pipes running like veins through the ground. The wind was soft now, carrying scents he had never imagined possible on this planet: mineral salts, faint sulfur, and the sweetness of thawed air. He crouched beside one of the main wells and placed his hand on its rim. The stone was warm and wet beneath his fingers, pulsing gently. He leaned close and listened to the sound within, a deep, rhythmic surge like a slow inhale. It was unmistakable. The planet was alive again. Jarrell appeared beside him, his heavy steps crunching softly against the thawed crust. You still talk to it, the Thrax said, his voice low. Evan didn't look up. It's talking back, he answered. Jarrell crouched beside him, his sharp scales reflecting the orange light of the vent. The commander says we're leaving, he said. Are you ready to go? Evan exhaled, his breath warm for once, not the white fog it used to be. Ready, yes, but not sure I want to. Jarrell grinned faintly, his sharp teeth glinting. You're strange, human. Most of us dream of warmth, yet when you find it, you want to stay in the cold. Evan chuckled quietly. Maybe because I've seen what warmth can do here. It's not just survival, it's rebirth. They stood in silence for a while, watching the wells pulse and sigh. Small streams ran between them now, carrying clear water that reflected the sky's dull light. The melted ice had formed shallow lakes where strange, pale plants had begun to appear, thread-like organisms that reached for the mist as if drinking it. The alien biologists had started cataloging them that morning, whispering in disbelief that life had returned so quickly. But Evan wasn't surprised. He had seen the signs weeks ago when the frost spores had bloomed on the warm stones. The heat had awakened everything that had been trapped beneath the surface. As night approached, the auroras returned, painting the mist with ribbons of green and violet. The light reflected off the vapor, turning the entire valley into a luminous ocean. The cadets gathered around the central well, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow. Someone began to cook rations over the vent, and laughter followed soon after. The sounds of life, voices, motion, even music played from a repaired transmitter, mingled with the deep hum of the planet below. Evan sat at the edge of the gathering, quietly watching. His hands were bandaged from weeks of labor, but they felt alive again, steady and strong. When the commander approached, he stood to greet her. She carried a small metallic plaque, the Academy's seal engraved on its surface. This will mark the site when we leave, she said, holding it out to him. The inscription read, Vareth 9 Thermal Experiment, the Human Method. He stared at it for a moment, then looked up. I didn't do it alone, he said. No, she agreed. But you began it, and sometimes that's all history remembers. She set the plaque into the ground beside the main vent, pressing it into the soft earth. Steam rose around it, hissing softly, as if the planet itself was acknowledging the gesture. As the night deepened, the sky cleared completely for the first time since their arrival. Through the thinning auroras, stars shimmered in sharp focus. Evan looked up at them and saw the faint glimmer of the approaching rescue ships, their blue lights piercing the blackness. The sight filled him with conflicting emotions, relief, pride, and a strange sense of loss. He had survived the impossible, but in doing so, he had found something greater than survival. He had found harmony between life and a world that had seemed lifeless. The next morning, the extraction team arrived. The great ships descended through the mist, their thrusters scattering clouds of steam across the valley. The heat wells hissed louder as if protesting the intrusion. The cadets gathered their equipment in silence, their faces reflecting the same quiet reluctance. Evan watched as the loading ramp lowered, bathing the ground in artificial light. He turned once more to the wells. The first one, the one he had dug by hand, still breathed steadily, releasing a thin glowing ribbon of vapor that twisted into the sky. He crouched beside it and whispered, "Keep burning." Then he pressed his palm against the warm stone, feeling the pulse beneath it one last time. When he boarded the ship, the valley was already fading beneath a veil of mist. Through the viewport, he watched as the steam continued to rise, painting the horizon with gold. The commander stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the same scene. "Do you think it will last?" she asked softly. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "The wells are stable. The heat will spread slowly. In a few years, this valley won't be frozen anymore. It'll be alive." She smiled faintly. "You sound like a man who fell in love with a planet." He didn't answer. The engines roared to life, and the ship began to lift. As the colony shrank beneath him, he saw the network of heat wells glowing faintly through the fog, forming a pattern that stretched far beyond the camp, circles connected by winding lines pulsing in unison. It looked like veins spreading across the surface, the arteries of a world awakening. The frost plains that had once symbolized death now shone with warmth, reflecting the light of the twin suns that had begun to rise on the horizon. Evan pressed his hand against the glass, watching until the planet became a small blue sphere surrounded by drifting clouds of vapor. He thought of the first time he had touched the frozen ground and felt the heartbeat beneath it. And he smiled. Varith 9 was no longer silent. The planet that had broken every furnace now burned with its own fire, and in its thawing breath, it carried the memory of one man who refused to freeze.